welcome everyone. Are you all ready tonight? I want to welcome everyone here and everyone watching. And I want to remind everyone, if you're watching and you have a prayer need at any time, feel free to call 877-281-6297. We have licensed prayer ministers and anointed that are ready to pray with you and agree with you for all your prayer needs. So are you all ready to get started tonight? Well, I want to share something that I really got out of last week that really spoke to me. And that was that being a conservative is not just about ideas and about values, but it's also about conserving our Constitution. And that means protecting our Constitution. Amen? So to do that, we have to know what's in the Constitution. Right? So we've got a fire hose of information. We're sitting here, we're ready. We're college style, we call KCB style, ready to learn, ready to write. So if you all are ready, let's give a warm EMIC welcome to Jonathan Ritchie from Wall Builders. Jonathan?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. How are y'all? Sorry for not being here last week. I was in the middle of something. So, no, I was driving down from D.C. with a whole bunch of new artifacts and things, so maybe in the future we'll be bringing some. I heard that Tim forgot his artifacts last week. I'm so sorry. I brought some this week, so we'll be able to get into that. But we have a lot of information to cover this week because today we're going to go through Articles 2 through the end of the Constitution. So strap in, buckle up. If you've seen the new Top Gun movie, right, it's time to turn and burn on the constitutional information. We're going to throw 9 G's of constitutional history at you today. We're going to go to the limits of your airframe of knowledge. So we'll jump into it. But to just kind of give you a brief summary from last week, there are basically, as we approach the Constitution, it's good to understand the outline that we're looking at. So you approach the Constitution, it's a big document, it's got 4 pages. How do we understand it and break it down? And it's pretty easy for the first 3 articles because you have the 3 branches of government. So Article 1 is primarily concerned with the legislative power, which is Congress, which is what Tim talked about last week. And then you have Article 2, which establishes the executive power, and then Article 3, which is what establishes the judiciary. And so today we're going to jump into there it is. We're going to jump into Article 2 and then just keep running through it. So Article 2 deals with the executive. You can see here, this is an actual scan of the Constitution. You can see it up in the Capitol. If you ever have the opportunity to go up there, it's really cool to see the original. But the President of the United States is the constitutional officer that is vested with the executive functions of government. And that means they're the ones who execute the laws. And so if you open up your Constitution, look at Article 2, Section 1, it lays it out pretty simple terms. The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, and together with the vice president chosen for the same term. And so as we look over the scope of Article 2, there are a couple of key points that are good to know and be familiar with. The first one is kind of somewhat what Tim talked about, of having separate branches. So the executive power is vested in a separate branch from the legislative power and the judicial power. And we'll go into more about kind of why that is important, but another key point of Article 2 is that the executive power is vested in a single person, the President of the United States. It's kind of an interesting feature. The vice president doesn't really exercise any executive functions except in the case where the president either passes away or is impeached or is just unable to perform his duties as president. Because, if you have read and familiar with the Constitution, the vice president actually sits as the kind of the Speaker of the Senate or the President of the Senate. So he's actually over in the legislative branch unless called upon to function as the executive. So the reason why the Constitutional Convention and the framers put the executive power in one person was because of their experience with the Articles of Confederation, where the executive power was broken up into a committee, and it was just very difficult to get things done when time was of the essence, and they needed energy, and they needed action to execute the laws that were being passed. Another key point of Article 2 is that the president is elected through an electoral college. This is something that is really misunderstood today, and there's a lot of people who want to maybe get rid of the electoral college because it's just not understood. Why do we have to do that when it's the 21st century, right? We can all kind of go in and vote, and it should just be a popular vote. But before we make that change to the Constitution, it's important to understand why the framers set it up in the first place, because, you know, like it says in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. And so they were asking many of the same questions that people ask today regarding the function and form of how should we elect the person who is going to be vested with the supreme executive power of our country. It's an important question to ask. So as we go into each of these key points of Article 2, when we look at the reason for there being a separate branch of government, we can look at a book from 1833 by one of the Supreme Court justices named Joseph Story. It's called Commentaries on the Constitution. It's a really good introductory book if you're wanting to dive a little further into the meaning of the various phrases. I mean, he goes phrase by phrase. He even spends time talking about why commas are in one spot versus another spot. So if you really want to deep dive, this is a great book to go into that if you like commas and constitutional law. But he has a great examination of why there just has to be separation between the branches. Because prior to the American Revolution, right, we were underneath a monarchy. This document I have right here is actually signed up here at the top by King George III. So this is from 1799. I'll probably have it with me in the back afterwards if y'all want to, get a kind of closer picture of it. But back when we were part of England, everything went through the king, and he had ultimate kind of authority. Even though there was parliament, the king was able to overrule parliament. And an interesting thing to note is that England actually, to this day, doesn't have a written constitution. And that's one of the big differences and the big reason why the founders like, let's for the supreme law of the land, write it down so that everybody can know what their rights are. And then two, so that we never go back to this thinking like what the kings of England had, that I'm above the law. Right, we're a nation of laws, and everybody, including the executive branch, including the legislators, including the judicial officers, are all underneath that law. So Joseph Story looks at the separation, and he explains that the principle is embraced in every state constitution. It seems now to be assumed among us as a fundamental maxim of government that the legislative, executive, and judicial departments ought to be separate, and the powers of one ought not to be exercised by either of the others. And so as we look at a lot of the form and function of the Constitution, and especially the parts that are kind of confusing at times, it's like, why did they go through all of these efforts to just make it almost needlessly confusing? It's not for no reason. They're doing it in order to separate the power, to make sure it doesn't become consolidated into a single person. Because, unfortunately, people are people, and oftentimes people don't do good things when they're given ultimate power. So the Founding Fathers were very intentional about breaking that up. But still, when it comes to the executive branch of government, they recognize that there has to be a balance, and that executive functions work better when somebody's able to make a decision when it needs to be made. And so also Joseph Story kind of balances that and says that the most distinguished statesmen have uniformly maintained the doctrine that there ought to be a single executive and a numerous legislature. It's kind of that balance, that check and balance. They have considered energy as the most necessary qualification of the executive power, and this is best attained by reposing the power in a single hand. This directly kind of comes from the misfortunes that America experienced underneath the Articles of Confederation, where you have examples that we'll go into a little bit later, where there are actually armed rebellions happening in the various states, but the federal government at that time, underneath the Articles, are unable to do anything because there's no energy invested in the executive kind of branch of government underneath the Articles of Confederation, and the states are kind of left helpless, and that's in a domestic kind of insurrection. What would happen if another war breaks out? What if England invades us again? The executive power has to be able to act, and that's why you see in the Constitution it's the legislature that, is the one that declares war, but once war is declared, the executive is the commander-in-chief, because once that decision has been made, now's the time to act. And so that's where it goes into that. And then another reason why they vested the executive into a single person, that of the president, is because it allows everybody to keep a really good watch on what he does. And so James Wilson, who was an early judge, he was also one of the framers, he explains that the next good quality that I remark is that the executive authority is one. We may discover from history, from reason, and from experience the security which this furnishes. The executive power is better to be trusted when it has no screen, i.e. there's nobody for it to hide behind. He cannot roll upon any other person the weight of his criminality. And Wilson actually says this in one of the ratification debates, where he's saying, look, this allows us, the entire country, to keep close watch on this one person who's entrusted with this massive weight and responsibility. And so if he steps aside from that, then we know it's his fault. It's his responsibility. One of the presidents in the 1900s used to keep a sign on his desk that says, "The buck stops here," right? There's nowhere else for responsibility to go. And that's something that sometimes is forgot, I think, today. But that's the original reason why it's invested in one person, because that way we're able to keep tabs on what's going on. The people are able to hold them accountable for their actions. Now let's look at the Electoral College. So why do we elect presidents not through a popular vote or other means of electing the executive? Because if you look at some of the state constitutions, especially at this time, there were many of them that actually the state legislative assembly would have a vote to appoint a governor, and other states had it where it was a popular vote. And so as you go into and look at the Constitution, it's worthwhile to read this section to get into it a little more closely. And it says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof, so the state assemblies, may direct a number of electors, equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. So this is kind of a chunky phrase. It's got a lot of information in there. But to help us understand, if we go back to the records of the debates of the Constitutional Convention, we can look at the different systems that they were thinking of establishing. And so during the convention, there are really two options that are presented, and then they found a medium in between them. So the first established one that they suggested was that we just let Congress, the national legislative body, pick a president. Now, the objections to this were pretty self-evident. Well, if we let the guys that are already in power in the federal government choose who's going to execute the executive functions, they're just going to choose one of their own. Also, there's going to be, bribery and corruption of okay, I'm going to vote for you this time, but next time it's my turn, So let's do this little quid pro quo. I'll get you in this time, but then it's going to be my turn. We'll just keep passing it around amongst this just select group of people. On the other side of the equation, there are people that were saying, let's make it a direct popular vote. Let's make it just direct. Whoever gets 51% or the most votes out of everybody in the nation, that's going to be the president, which seems to make sense. Obviously, in the 1700s, some people were like, well, technologically speaking, that's going to be extremely difficult because people are everywhere and we have to use, horses. There's no cell phones. You can't hop online and vote that way back then. But there was also another objection to this, which is important to understand because obviously technology has changed, but principles stay the same. And so they said if it's just a direct popular vote, then all it's going to take is one or two states, the largest states, to elect a president, elect an executive. In fact, if we were to have a direct popular vote of the executive today, it would only take the people of the top 20 most populous cities in America in order to choose who's going to be the executive officer. What does that mean? It means that candidates are only going to visit those 20 cities and they're only going to really be concerned with the cares and desires of those places, which means that the entire rest of the country is just going to be passed over. And then two, people from those cities are going to vote for the home team. So, you can look at the two biggest population states today. You've got California, you've got Texas. It's going to come down to who can win those states and a couple of the other ones, right? And so before too long, 95% of the presidents are just going to be people from Texas or people from California. And the rest of the states aren't going to really figure into choosing who is going to be the executive officer of the country. And so what they suggested is, what if, instead of making it the National Legislative Assembly or directly the people, what if every 4 years we create a new kind of assembly that is selected by the people of the states in a manner set up by the legislative bodies of those states. So it's balancing, right? It's not going to be the national legislature setting this up and choosing who's the president, but it's going to be still from the people who are the ultimate kind of possessors of power in the constitutional framework. They're going to choose electors. That method of choosing is going to differ from state to state. It's not going to be federally mandated. And so those state electors will then be responsible for coming together and casting their votes for president. And the reasons they explained are given most succinctly in the Federalist Papers, which were written by three people: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and also John Jay. And in Federalist number 68, it's explained that it was desirable that the sense of the people should operate in the choice of the person to whom so important a trust was to be confided. This end will be answered by committing the right of making it not to any pre-established body, i.e. not to the National Legislative Assembly, but to the men chosen by the people for the special purpose and at the particular conjuncture, i.e. at that time. So every 4 years, these people aren't sitting in Washington, D.C. during the entire rest of the year just waiting to choose another one of their own guys. They're people who live in those states selected by the people for this particular purpose and this purpose alone. And then Federalist 68 continues, it was equally desirable that the immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station. A small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass will be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to so complicated an investigation. So basically, it's like the people of the states are going to choose people that they trust to make a judgment value based on experience, based on prior actions, based on known moral character in order to choose presidents. And that's the system that the framers set up. So, simple, right? Easy, anybody can do it. So that's how presidents are made. This is actually a kind of a really cool picture of George Washington showing up. Obviously, it's a little dramatized, but showing up in New York, which was the original capital before Washington, D.C. gets built. So it's a real famous engraving, and it's pretty cool. So that's how presidents are made. But what happens now? So we've chosen a guy. This is the way that the framers set it up in the Constitution. But what happens once somebody's selected? And this is where, at the end of Article 2, Section 1, it says, before he enter on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And this is extremely significant, especially when we start diving into the example that George Washington provides when he becomes the first president, because we'll see and learn what do they mean by oath. And so as we look at George Washington's inauguration, which happens after the ratification of the Constitution in 1789, one of the first things that you'll notice is that in the kind of progression of the events of that day, there are 14 different religious leaders involved in the inauguration. And they're both rabbis and Christian ministers. But when we dive into it further, we'll find that there are 8 distinct religious activities that Washington does. And this is something that's often overlooked, but it's extremely important because the founding fathers and the framers understood that for government to work, for a free government to work, the people have to be moral and virtuous. In fact, John Adams talks about how the Constitution of America is designed for a moral and upright people, and it's totally inapplicable to any other type of people. Because if we're going to be free, we have to be self-controlled, because otherwise we're not going to be able to live in the freedom that God has given us of these inalienable rights. So when we look at the religious activities on this day, in a newspaper called the Daily Advertiser, it talks about that New York that morning of the day of which our illustrious president will be invested with his office, the bells will ring at 9 o'clock, when the people may go up to the house of God and in a solemn manner commit the new government with its important train of consequences to the holy protection and blessing of the Most High. An early hour is prudently fixed for this peculiar act of devotion and is designed wholly for prayer. So literally the whole city says, on this day, we're going to stop what we're doing. We're going to ring the bells, and we want everybody to go to church, because this is such a momentous moment for the country, where we're embarking on this new system of government, which really has never been tried in the history of the world, where they're able to have deliberated on this without any, kind of outside pressure, and come to a conclusion of what path should we take together. But no matter what path we choose, we have to start it with prayer. And so the whole city stops for that, and that's kind of the first religious event that happens that day. But once we get to the actual swearing-in ceremony for George Washington, it occurs at the Federal Hall in New York City, and actually kind of around on the side, there's a portico where they would all gather up for it right there. And it was done there so that the people of the city could, after they spent time in church praying, come in and be a participant in this ceremony. And so this is kind of a early 1800s depiction of that day. And you can see, Washington up there with his hand on the Bible like that. That Bible is actually still up in D.C. You can see it up there, which is really cool that that's been preserved as an artifact. Unfortunately, I'm not able to bring it for you today. I always ask, but then, they're like, no, this is kind of something we'll keep you up here. And then if you just try to pick it up, they frown at that. So, but when it actually comes time to take the oath of office, there's a number of very important things, especially for Christians, to be aware of and really recognize. Particularly, what did the Founding Fathers mean when they said an oath? And you can actually look at James Madison, who is sometimes called the father of the Constitution, and I would somewhat debate that. There were other people at the Constitutional Convention that were extremely important, but this is actually a letter from James Madison, which I'll have in the back afterwards. You can see his handwriting. This was from 1820. He's writing from his home in Virginia. But Madison says something that's very interesting. And he explains that an oath is the strongest of religious ties. The strongest of religious ties. And this is one of those guys that had his hand in every single part of the Constitution in those debates, and as they are kind of really nailing down the language, because they're being extremely specific about what these words mean. It's not just like they're throwing these in there and shaking it up and hoping it turns out to a good country. They're being super specific. And so when Madison says an oath is a religious action, that should perk your ears up and be like, okay, I'm interested and want to know more. Well, another one of the Founding Fathers, a gentleman named John Witherspoon, he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was also an active minister, and he was a president of Princeton University, a very important guy, trained many of the other Founding Fathers. He has in his writings that an oath is an appeal to God and implies a belief in God and His providence, and is indeed an act of worship. That's significant. This is the guy who trained a lot of the other Founding Fathers. So him and Madison are on the same page, and George Washington was as well. They understood what that meant, because it implies a belief in God. Because who are you really promising? Who sees everything that's done in Washington, D.C.? God does. So when you are saying, I take an oath that I'm going to uphold and defend the Constitution, that promise is to the people of the United States, but most importantly, it's to God, because He's the one who we're all ultimately accountable to, no matter what office you're elected to, right? And so it was very clear in the founding era that when you take an oath of office, it's an act of worship. And this is something that goes back for hundreds of years. At the library, we have a printed oath card from colonial America in it's really about the 1650s, and it's got "So help me God" written on there. And in fact, when Washington takes the oath in New York, it is actually in the New York statutes that when you take an oath, you have to say, "So help me God." And if you read the newspapers, everybody says that Washington said that as well because he understood that taking an oath is a religious action. It's something that implies a belief in God. Additionally, too, like I mentioned, he gets sworn in on a Bible. It's actually kind of funny because they all get there, and in the hustle and bustle of this is the first inauguration, they're looking around and they're like, "We forgot the Bible, guys." And so they send this poor guy running down the street to pick one up, and it's this big old Bible too. And so I can only imagine this guy, this intern, right, is like lugging this thing down the street. So he gets there, and he actually has it open to Genesis 49, and then afterwards, it's very interesting in the eyewitness reports, Washington actually leans down and kisses the Bible as an act of piety and devotion. And if we look at the Bible, what does it say about, making an oath and things of that nature? Well, in Isaiah 62:8, it says the Lord has sworn by his right hand, and hence the right hand is on the Bible. And then additionally, too, like I mentioned, of saying, "So help me God," he also says, or the Bible says in Deuteronomy 10:20, "You shall take oaths in his name." And so as you read the writings of the founding fathers, and especially early legal jurists in the English and American tradition, they're very explicit about why do we do these things? It's because the Bible tells us to. And so as we continue going, after Washington takes the oath, it comes time for him to give the first inaugural address. And it's super cool that it's preserved actually in his own handwriting, and you can find scans of this online. But it's to the fellow citizens of the Senate and of the House of Representatives. And in it, as we break it down, one of the things that he does first off the bat is actually offer a prayer to God. And I've got it kind of highlighted right here, but I'm cheating and I wrote it out because sometimes the cursive's a little difficult, right? And it says, "It would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that almighty being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States." Washington has just been elected to be the supreme executive, but in his first action in that role, he takes a step back and says, "Guys, while I might be exercising the supreme executive function underneath the Constitution, there's a higher executive power at play here, and his name is God. And everything that we do has to rely on him for its success. No matter how much time and deliberation was put into framing the Constitution, Washington understood if it doesn't have God's help, it's all going to crash and burn." And then he turns to the people and says, "You guys need to pray as well, because we all need to be in this together." And so again, this is how it looks in his own handwriting, but he tells them people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States, which is a super significant thought, right? Ultimately, it's God that's behind the direction of the country, and ultimately, the country is God's. It's all God's. And he's more important than even the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. And that's a lot of words. Basically, Washington's just saying God's in charge. In one of his wartime letters, he's actually writing to a fellow general in the Continental Army, and he's going down a list of all the times that he has seen God's hand manifestly intercede on behalf of Americans. And he stops halfway through and he says, "But it will be time for me to turn preacher after the war," right? He's like, I know you know this, but every single time he really steps into a new role, Washington is very careful to acknowledge who's ultimately responsible for the good and safety of America. And then at the end, he also closes with another prayer. And there it is in his handwriting, and he says, "I shall take my present leave," so I'm not going to go forever, "but not without resorting once more to the benign parent of the human race, in humble supplication that since he has been pleased to favor the American people, so his divine blessing may be equally conspicuous in the enlarged views, the temperate consultations, and the wise measures on which the success of this government must depend." And so as America is embarking underneath this new experiment of government, Washington, as the executive, is saying, we have to turn to God in all of our ways. Otherwise, it's all going to be for naught. And so he kind of reviews and says, right, he offers his prayer. He says, you guys need to pray too. And then he ends it with prayer again. And then after this, they actually, in the debates and proceedings of the Congress, they actually all decide to go to church together. And so after Washington finished up his inaugural prayer, Congress decides that after the oath shall be administered to the president, he, attended by the vice president, the members of the Senate, and the House of Representatives, proceeded to St. Paul's Chapel to hear divine services. So literally the first action that the new government takes is to go to church together. And so they walk down the street and they go to St. Paul's Chapel and they hear a sermon by the first chaplain of the Senate, Reverend Samuel Provost, and he leads prayer and basically takes them through a Bible study. In fact, if you go to the church today, you can see one of the stained glass windows showing the first Congress and Washington and the Vice President John Adams together in the pews listening to this sermon as they are beginning this new stage of our history. And so that is kind of the beginning tone of the executive office. Now, if you've been paying attention for the last maybe 50 some odd years, we don't typically have that much focus on God, and I think that's a problem. And I think a lot of our issues in America would be resolved if we looked back and all went to church together, right? Wouldn't that be crazy to see all of Congress, all of the executive officers walking down the street to go to church together? So as we look at the key responsibilities and duties of the executive officer, there are really three things that Article 2 lays out. One, he acts as the commander-in-chief of the military, which I talked about a little bit before. He's also in charge of appointing officers, such as the judges. And then it explicitly commands the president to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And that's why it's called the executive power, because he is the one really kind of taking the laws that Congress passes and making sure that they're being faithfully followed. But just like there's a separation of powers, there's also checks and balances on the executive. And so one of the biggest checks on the executive is the fact that they can be impeached if they do things wrong, right? And so Article 2, Section 4 says, the president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. And that's really the biggest check on the executive, aside from the fact that they have no legislative power. They can't make any laws. And so that's Article 2, right? We can take a breath. We got through Article 2, and now we're on to Article 3. And so Article 3 is the judicial branch. And this is very interesting because as you look at the Constitution, you will see what was important and what kind of the order of power was, because oftentimes we think that the three branches of government are co-equal. They all have the same amount of power, but the Founding Fathers were very clear that they don't. And we'll get into some of their quotes on that. But as we look at the judicial branch, the Constitution says, as it opens up Article 3, Section 1, that the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. And this is already very interesting for a number of reasons, the way that they set this up. But big picture on Article 3, the key points are these. One, that the Supreme Court is established by the Constitution, but Congress establishes the rest. So already this is kind of a check and a limitation on the judicial power. The Supreme Court is the only constitutionally mandated federal judicial power, and then Congress is actually allowed to control how many other inferior courts there are, the circuit courts, the various district courts, things of that nature. And as you go through the early decades of America, you'll see that Congress tries a whole bunch of different things. In fact, originally all the Supreme Court justices had to ride on horseback across the country to go to the different areas and hold trials there. Eventually, like all the justices were quitting because they were all very old and were like, we don't want to ride on horseback across the country anymore. Which, I mean, fair enough. Additionally, Article 3 lays out that the federal judiciary power is supposed to handle cases under the Constitution and the controversies between the states. So, right, you have to have some place to mediate controversies between the states. During this time, there were actually some states who were in armed conflict against each other because of border disputes and things of that nature. So there had to be some place where they can go to find resolution for these things. And then 3, it also ensures trial by jury, which is a very important thing, because underneath the king in England, King George III, and other English monarchs, that was not a secure right. I mean, they would have these show trials and just condemn people without ever allowing juries to be heard. And in fact, when William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, was convicted or he was jailed for having different religious beliefs than the king, the jury actually found him not guilty, and the king steps in and actually throws all the jurors in jail. They're like, that's the wrong decision. All you guys are going to jail too, and William Penn, you're going with them. And so the framers are like, we've got to ensure that people's right to be judged by a jury of their peers is preserved, and so that's a constitutionally ensured right. And then also it sets the definition for treason. And so another kind of important thing. And so what are the checks on the judiciary? Well, just like underneath the executive, judges can be impeached, even Supreme Court judges. It's often said that, a appointment to the Supreme Court is a lifetime appointment, but that's inaccurate. As we look at Article 3, Section 1, it says, judges, both as the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior. So judges don't hold lifetime appointments. As you look at the early federal judges, and even a Supreme Court judge who was impeached, he didn't get convicted, so he retained his spot, but federal judges were impeached for things such as, like drinking too much alcohol. They were like, that's not good behavior, you're out of here. That's not the type of morals that we have to have in our judiciary to make sure our laws are executed justly. You're out of here. And so it was very common in the early decades for judges to be impeached. And it still happens today, we just don't hear about it very often. And so Supreme Court appointments are not for life. It's only for the duration of good behavior. And so obviously it becomes a question, well, what is good behavior? And obviously people have different opinions. But the Founding Fathers, based on their Christian understanding, they're implying that it's kind of Judeo-Christian morals and values. And when you break that, you can't really be trusted to be a just moderator between conflicting parties. Additionally, too, another check on the judiciary was that they were only given very narrow original jurisdiction. So the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary is only allowed to be the kind of first court you go to in a very limited number of cases, what does that mean? It means that justice is more often practiced by the local and state courts, which means that power and justice is more closely resided to the communities, to the peoples. You're not always looking to Washington, D.C. to solve your problems. You're looking to your neighbors to handle it first, and then Congress is able to give appellate jurisdiction to the Supreme Court. So, right, you can appeal these cases up and ultimately reach the Supreme Court, but you have to start in your communities first when you're looking for justice in many cases. And Joseph Story, again, explains this in his book, The Commentaries on the Constitution, and he explains that the jurisdiction, which is by the Constitution, to be exercised by the Supreme Court in original form is very limited, and Congress cannot constitutionally confer on it any other or further original jurisdiction. So the framers are like, this is your area that you're allowed and you need to execute judgment in, and Congress can't continually add to that. It can't usurp that authority that's rightfully preserved by the states and by the people ultimately. And so as we look at kind of the balance of power in these first 3 articles, it's very interesting to look at how much time the Founding Fathers actually spent talking about these various powers. Because if you look, Article 1 is extremely long. It's 2,294 words. Article 2, the executive, is only 1,025 words. Article 3 for the judiciary is only 377 words. And that's including the titles, right? It's dramatically shorter, and that tells us something about the perspective of the Founding Fathers. Again, the Federalist Papers offer a lot of really good insight into this, and James Madison in Federalist 51 explains that the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers into the same branch or same person consists in giving to those who administer each the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachment on the others. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition, i.e., if these various branches of government are too busy arguing amongst themselves on what's the best course of action, it's not going to allow one person to step in and take the reins of all of the branches. Additionally, too, Federalist 51 continues and says, a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessary of auxiliary precautions. In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. And that should make sense because the legislative power, Article 1, is one of the longest part of the Constitution, but it's also the power that is most closely related to everybody, right? Representatives are chosen by a direct vote. Senators originally were chosen by a vote of the state assemblies, and so you have both the people having a direct voice in the government and also a wing of government that's devoted to protecting the rights of the states as well from federal encroachments. In Federalist number 78, it talks specifically about the judiciary and why it's, real short when you look at it. And Hamilton explains that in a government in which the branches of government, are separated from each other, the judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution because it will be the least in a capacity to annoy or injure them. Now, for us today, when we think about the Supreme Court, we don't think of a very weak branch of government, right? I mean, there are big questions sitting at the Supreme Court that seem to have a dramatic effect on the way that the country is going. But as we look at the original framework of the Constitution, it wasn't designed to be that way. Also, one of the things I have here is an envelope signed by Alexander Hamilton. So that's kind of a fun thing as well. But when you look at the original Supreme Court, this is the room. And it's literally in the basement of the Capitol building. It wasn't even in its own building like it is today. It's literally underneath on a lower floor as the legislative branch in the House and the Senate. This is literally a picture of the entire room. Like that is it. That's where the judges would sit, and then that's where the parties would sit, and then you have a few pews for the gallery. And the windows are at the very top, and it would often get extremely hot, and literally that was it. It was just in the basement. But when you look at the original composition of the Supreme Court, there are 6 original Supreme Court justices, including John Jay, James Wilson, who we quoted from earlier, William Cushing, John Blair, John Rutledge, and James Iredell. And all these guys are significant from their various states. But once the Constitution gets rolling and people start filling these positions of government, all these guys are appointed by George Washington, but they start resigning pretty shortly after. In fact, John Rutledge from South Carolina resigns from the Supreme Court without ever hearing a case. And he actually, this is a picture of him right here, he resigns in 1791, and he explains that really, it's a waste of time for him to be in the Supreme Court of America, and he's going to go back and become a judge, a chief justice on a state court in South Carolina because he views that as a more important and a more prestigious and a more significant position. So literally, he quits because it's not an important enough position for him to do, and goes back to his state. He's not the only one who does that, though, out of the original court. The original Chief Justice, John Jay, and this is a letter written by John Jay in 1800 right here. I'll have it at the back if you want to see his signature. It's pretty cool. John Jay resigns in 1795 for a very similar reason. He actually gets sent overseas to help negotiate a treaty, and when he comes back, he finds that he has won the election to be governor of New York and promptly resigns his position on the Supreme Court of America to go be the governor of New York. And John Adams, when he becomes president, he tries to convince John Jay to come back and be a Supreme Court justice. And John Jay writes to Adams and says, I left the bench, talking about the Supreme Court, perfectly convinced that under a system so defective, it would not obtain the energy, weight, and dignity which was essential to its affording due support to the national government, nor acquire the public confidence and respect which, as the last resort of the justice of the nation, it should possess. So John Jay is literally telling Adams, I'm not going to come back to the Supreme Court because it's literally not important enough for me to go do. He doesn't view that as a significant a role, which really corresponds with what Hamilton was talking about in the Federalist paper, that it's a very weak branch of government when compared to the executive and when compared to the legislative powers. And so that's something that obviously today, as you look around, is completely flipped. And indeed, even on the Supreme Court website, it calls itself a co-equal branch of government, which is in direct contradiction of all the history and all the documents and the original perspective of the Founding Fathers. So that's Article 3. We've only got 4 more articles to go, right? So Article 4 deals more specifically with the relation between the states, because this is, at this time, underneath the Articles of Confederation, the states are really almost independent countries in many respects. I mean, you have various states trying to negotiate treaties with foreign powers in Europe on their own, and oftentimes in contradiction to what would be good for the rest of the states. And so there has to be kind of a mean and manner of negotiating this and representing a solid front to the rest of the world. And so the key points in Article 4 to really understand is that Section 1 normalizes the relationships between the various states, so sets up kind of rules for playing nice with each other. And then it also regularizes the standards of justice across the various states. So if you go from one state to the other, you don't immediately lose, all your rights and things of that nature. It also sets up the form of it admitting new states to the Union. So at this time, after the Revolution, many of the states kind of ceded their land claims to the federal government. And now what do we do with all these lands? So it allows for the federal government to exercise kind of territorial jurisdiction over these ceded lands, and then provides for a method of adding more states to the Union. The funniest kind of example of this is Virginia literally claimed everything from Virginia today all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They were like, all that over there, that's ours. And eventually they realized that was unattainable vision for them. And Virginia's already long enough to drive through. I mean, it just kind of keeps on going. And then you hit Tennessee, and it's just as long. But so they all cede these claims, and it provides for a systemized way of adding to the Union. And one of the most important parts is in Section 4 of Article 4 is it dictates that all these new states must have a Republican form of government, i.e. they must have a legislative assembly that is elected by the people and be kind of a reflection of the national government in its Republican format. And so Article 4, Section 4 also has this clause in it. It says, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion. So, right, it's a national front. We'll join together our forces in order to guard against an invasion from Europe or other powers. And on application of the legislature or the executive, when the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence. And this is interesting to point out because literally every single clause in the Constitution is addressing some issue that they had underneath the Articles of Confederation or underneath the British monarchy. And so actually just before the National Constitutional Convention, there was an event called Shea's Rebellion in Massachusetts, where a whole bunch of farmers in the more kind of western portions of Massachusetts got together in 1787 and basically formed their own army and was going to march to the seat of government in Massachusetts and potentially even to New York, the national government, and do something. They really didn't have a set plan, but they knew something was up and it needed to change. And so they started going, and I mean, it was thousands of people. And eventually this rebellion gets put down by a private army raised by the governor of Massachusetts, which is very weird to even say. How does the governor of Massachusetts raise a private army? Well, it's because he was unable to get any support from the national government underneath the Articles of Confederation because there wasn't an executive who was able to act. The legislature wasn't able to convene, wasn't able to come to a conclusion on this. And so while the rebellion was ultimately stopped, by the Massachusetts State Forces raised by the governor, it demonstrated that the various weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, and it actually led and was one of the immediate causes for the Constitutional Convention. So when all of these framers from the various states get together, this is literally something that had just happened a few months prior, and so that's why they put that clause in Article 4 of like, look, if a rebellion happens in your state, we'll provide a means for assisting in restoring order in that situation. So now we get to Article 5. Article 5 deals with amending the Constitution, because if we go back to week 1 where we talked about kind of the principles of the Declaration, where it's like, look, we have to be able to fix the problems of government. You know, the founding fathers realized that they were humans just like the rest of us, and the Constitution wasn't perfect. It wasn't going to be perfect because it's made by imperfect people. Obviously, they were hoping it would be better. It would be a more perfect union than what they had before, but they recognized the limitations of their own wisdom and own vision, and so they provide the means for amending and fixing it. And the key points are that one of the ways of getting amendments is that 2/3 of the Congress can propose changes, or 2/3 of the state legislatures can call a convention to propose amendments. And this is called a convention of states. It's in Article 5. And then once either Congress or the states have proposed amendments, these proposed amendments get submitted to the states for ratification, and it has to be agreed upon by a total of 3/4. So a pretty strong supermajority have to agree if a change is going to be made to the Constitution. And right now there's actually a pretty dominant movement to have a convention of states underneath Article 5 to propose new constitutional amendments. All the states in green are places that have actually already called for one of these conventions. And then the yellow ones are one where one of the state legislative bodies have passed it and it's currently waiting to be voted upon in the other one. And then the blue ones are where the progress is being started. And this is well over 2/3. So potentially in the next couple of years, we might be actually seeing a convention of states, which would be the first time that this happens since the Constitution was ratified in 1789. So from a historian's point, the next few years could be very interesting. Not necessarily something to look forward to, maybe, but it'd be very interesting to watch. So the Convention of States moving forward underneath Article 5. As we get to Article 6, this is where it deals with kind of big picture points relating international relations. So one of the big worries with Europe and the rest of it is, what about all the debts that the country had accrued underneath the Revolutionary War and then during the time where the Articles of Confederation were in effect? Is the new government just going to extinguish and say, those were those other guys, we're not going to pay you back the money that we took? And so the Constitution in Article 6 clearly states the principle of the continuation of debt. Like, look, if we incurred a debt with you underneath the prior administration, we're going to honor that debt and we're going to pay that back eventually. That ultimately happens underneath Andrew Jackson, and that's the only time in American history where America didn't actually have any debt, which is interesting. It also has the Supremacy Clause, and that basically says the Constitution and the treaties that are made with foreign powers underneath the constitutional direction are the supreme law of the land. And then it also includes that all officers underneath the Constitution have to take an oath to support and defend the Constitution or an affirmation, but that there's going to be no other religious test. And that was done so that, the Congress couldn't come together and vote to say only Anglicans can be a part of the government, only Baptists, only Congregationalists, etc., things of that nature. But it's still important to remember what they meant when they said oath, right? An oath is a religious act that implies a belief in God. So while they're not going to institute religious tests to ban certain denominations, there's certainly the assumption that if you're going to be in government, you have to be somebody who recognizes that they are also subservient to the Almighty God, who sees all of our actions and will ultimately hold us accountable. And as we get to Article 7 of the Constitution, this lays out the ratification process. Because, the Constitutional Convention had no authority to legislate for the rest of America. Any of their proposals had to then be submitted to the states. And Article 7 really lays out that process of, okay, now that we have this proposal for government, how do we switch over from the Articles of Confederation to this new Constitution. So Article 7 really just goes through the ratification process. It's pretty short. But sometimes when you read copies of the Constitution, this is where they stop. They say this is the end of Article 7, this is the end of the Constitution, and there's nothing else after that. In fact, if you type in text of the U.S. Constitution into Google, the first response will be a website that ends the Constitution here. But it actually cuts off a very significant and one of my favorite parts of the Constitution, which is called the Attestation Clause. And basically this is where it says that you can see the word right there, which is almost looks like door, but it's actually just done. So done in convention by the unanimous consent, and it continues to go on, of the states present in the 17th day of September, in the year of our Lord, 1787, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 12th. And so oftentimes people say, the Constitution, supreme law of the land, is a godless constitution. There was a book in 1996 published underneath that name that basically the whole point was to say, oh, the founding fathers weren't really Christian, because if they were, they would have included God in the Constitution. I hate to break it to you, man, but it's right there, like in the year of our Lord. And people say, oh, well, they just always put that there. Well, yeah, they put that there because it meant something to them, They didn't argue over commas and semicolons and periods and then say, oh, yeah, just throw whatever you want in there at the end. No, they're being extremely deliberate about every single word that goes in. And in case you want to see it for yourself, here is the Attestation Clause in full, and you can see it right there, in the year of our Lord, 1000 and so forth. And so it's very significant to me that the two things that it is dated, the Constitution is dated to, is one, the birth of Jesus, and then two, the birth of America, because those are two things that kind of provides the framework for their perspective on government and their purpose here, right? We can think back to the inauguration of George Washington. They very clearly saw themselves as, responsible unto God for the actions that they were about to take. And so even in the document itself, it is recognizing, look, this is done in the year of our Lord. And so for me, this is actually my favorite portion of the Constitution, and it's one that often gets actually just cut out. There are many editions of pocket constitutions that you might pick up, and it just doesn't have the attestation clause in there at all, which is, just very sad. So, but this is the document that gets finally agreed upon after months and months of fighting and bickering and arguing and debating and going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth again. It's a really fun time to read James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, because you really get a picture of how in-depth and how exhaustive this process was. Because imagine if we tried to get everybody in this room to agree on one thing for the entire rest of the nation. That's a difficult thing to do. But the battle isn't over. Now that they've agreed on something, this is submitted to the states. And so every single state holds a ratification assembly where they do the same exact process. They go line by line, comma by comma, and debate the meaning and the various virtues and merits of this proposed Constitution. And it's very interesting to read those debates. There was a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Elliott who actually published a 5-volume set of all of these ratification debates. And it's fascinating to see who agrees and who disagrees and what points they make. Because you get some guys who say, I'm not going to vote for this Constitution because it doesn't abolish slavery. And then you go to the ratification debates in South Carolina, and you get guys in South Carolina saying, I'm not going to vote for this Constitution because it does abolish slavery. And it's like, whoa, how can people see this so differently on it? And so it's very interesting to see. But also what's notable is that 70 people were actually sent or chosen to be delegates to the Constitutional Convention, but only 55 people ever showed up. Out of those 55 people, only 33 signed the final version. So you have a lot of very prominent founding fathers who were, very serious and sincere patriots during the Revolutionary War who aren't so sure about this proposed Constitution. And so next week, Tim and I will be going more in depth into the ratification struggle, the debates, what they said, why we have a Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments, so they weren't included in the original version of the Constitution. And some of the big founding fathers that disagreed with the Constitution include guys like Patrick Henry, right? The give me liberty, give me death guy. I mean, he is a very significant guy in Virginia, and he is not a fan of this Constitution, and he is not afraid to tell everybody who will listen to him about that. Other guys kind of on a different part of the country that are also against this Constitution include guys like Sam Adams, who has very serious reservations about how the system is being made, and it's out of these ratification debates that the Bill of Rights ultimately comes from. So next week is what we'll talk about regarding that. If you want, I know this has been a very information-heavy one. I didn't have too many jokes or anything. Tim wasn't here to crack in and say stuff like that, but we had to get through. We had to get through all these articles, and we did it, right? Amen. I highly, good job to you guys. I didn't notice anybody falling asleep because I would have come down there. I got a little pointer on this, you know. Actually, back when I was in college, I was a very excited student, but I wasn't a very energetic student. And so I had this one 8 a.m. class my first semester where I would show up early to class. I would sit in the front row. I would be super into it for the first 15 minutes. And then as soon as that clock hit minute 16, I would pass out on the front row. Every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And the professor was an extremely great guy. He was a pastor, and but he definitely tried many means of waking me up with chalk and other things like that. I learned a lot, but I learned a lot through osmosis too. So good job for you guys for getting through the Constitution. I highly encourage you guys in preparation for next week, not to give y'all homework or anything. You know, I'm not going to quiz y'all. Tim might, but I won't. I'm the cool teacher. I hope he doesn't watch that. I highly encourage you guys to read through the Constitution again and try to think about it from the perspective of somebody receiving this in 1787. What are the questions that you have about it? What are the things that you don't understand? Why? What are the things that maybe you would push back on if you were in that position? Because that's really kind of the purpose of history. History comes from the Greek word meaning inquiry, which means questions. You know, we should question boldly the past. We should question boldly what's before us because that's how we really come to an understanding of it. And like the Bible says, if you seek, you will find. And so we should really be seekers of the truth and with everything, with the Constitution, with the Bible, with history, and what we do. So read the Constitution this week again. If you haven't been already, ask questions about it. Come thinking those questions. If you really want to get into it, you can go to wallbuilders.com. You can get some of our resources and things of that nature. And if you want to be the smartest person in the room, if you read all 5 of those volumes of the ratification conventions, you'll be my best friend for life. So, but I think that's just about all the time for today. So thank you.
How thankful are we for Jonathan? I want to know what he knows. So you all ready for a test on the first 7 articles? We're going to pass that out? No, just kidding. How thankful are we to be in a church that cares about our knowledge of the Constitution? One of the most important things I heard was that an oath of office is an act of worship. And I know that this is so near and dear to our pastors' hearts, Pastor George and Pastor Terry. They want to equip us to be great Christian Americans. And they're the ones that put this together, and we're just thankful and grateful to them for doing that. I want to, if we can put up 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10. We have that? It's in the Bible. It's just before 2 Peter. All right, I want to read this. This says, as each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Have you all received a good gift tonight? This has been an amazing series. Now, we have an opportunity to now, as good stewards of God's grace, serve one another, to serve our partners at Wall Builders and give to their cause so that this message can get out to many. So we have that opportunity. So tonight we're going to we're going to do that. So if you're going to write a check tonight, make your checks payable to EMIC. The envelopes are all provided at the tables in front of you, and those will be collected on your way out tonight. Online, emic.org/give, guest speaker. And if you're going to give by text, that is EMIC guest to 36609. And by phone, 877-281-6297. By mail, EMIC, Fort Worth, Texas, 76192. And you note on that, Wall Builders presentation. All right, that you all get something tonight? All right. So we've got one more amazing week next Wednesday to wrap up our constitutional series. You're not going to miss it. Tim Barton will be back as well. But until then, remember, God loves you, we love you, and Jesus is Lord.
What an amazing couple of weeks we have had. This is week 3 of our Constitution Education series with the folks from Wall Builders, Tim Barton, tonight, Jonathan Ritchie. How amazing was that? Welcome here to Eagle Mountain International Church, the revival capital of the world. I'm Stephen Shelton with you, and we're so glad that you joined us. We're so glad that you are a part of our church family. I can't say that enough. You are so important to what God is doing here at EMIC. And if you have been impacted by EMIC, by anything on the Victory Channel, really, we want to hear from you. We want to hear your testimony of what God has done through Victory in your life. We've heard testimonies of people that leave it on for their pets all day. But how has the programming changed your life? Flashpoint, Victory News, any of our programmers. We want you to go to govictory.com/testimony so that you can share that with us. We want to get your testimony, and we want to be able to rejoice and celebrate with you about what God is doing in your life. I know plenty of people have testimonies about what God has shown them during this series. Okay, so I got to tell you, Southwest Believers Convention is coming up, and I'm really excited about one speaker in particular. This will be the first year we've had him on the arena stage, so check out this promo for Southwest Believers Convention.
There's someone in us who can tell us something about the future that the rest of this world doesn't know. You can wake up every single day and know something about the way the day's gonna go because you've got inside information.
It's Wide Open Faith at the Southwest Believers Convention. Register today at kcm.org/SWBC.
I am so excited to have Pastor Jeremy Pearsons, speaking at Southwest Believers Convention 2022, the Fort Worth Convention Center, August 1st through the 6th. We need to see you there. You got to do what you got to do. Make sure you make arrangements now. It is going to be a week that can change your life. All right, join us next week for the next part of the Constitution series. Remember this, God loves you, we love you, Jesus is Lord.
Tulsa was only the beginning.